Good afternoon. I shall start this session by first introducing you to Mr. Keith Hampson, a great long-standing friend of the school and member of the advisory board of the Moscow School, a person who has been instrumental in structuring the school's British expert community and the program. So we salute him. We have known and worked with Keith since 1998. And when we had the anniversary of the school, the jubilee, we had this great time at the British Parliament in a country which is perceived by many as the cradle of the modern parliamentarianism. We remember this meeting with Smith Thatcher, and we remember this meeting, the cordial meeting she accorded us on the 20th anniversary of the school 2 years ago. In November, Keith made this also a most memorable event. We had this jubilee at the Parliament, at the Houses of Parliament, and in the quarters of the Speaker of the British Parliament, which was an unforgettable evening. Many of the very esteemed British people were there for the first time, just like we were. Keith Hampson has been a British MP from Leeds. He is a historian. He is graduate of Oxford University, and I shall allow him to introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you very much. This is no insult to Lena. It's merely to put the record straight so that all of you have it as it is, which is that when you look at your program, it tells you that I was a member of the House of Lords from 1974 till 1997. Now, Lena loves ladies and lords, and members of the House of Lords come here a lot, but I ain't ever been a lord and not likely ever to be a lord. I was an elected member of the House of Commons, and furthermore, I didn't actually go to Oxford. Hugo went to Cambridge, the big rival place, but I actually went to a very much more humble establishment called Bristol University, which those who fail to get into Oxford and Cambridge usually ended up in Bristol. Now, it's always an enormous pleasure to come here, and I have been now coming for about 15 years, and to look around this room, which essentially the school created. This wasn't a room, essentially, when we first started coming here. But Lena decided this was a space she wanted because it presented to her, to the students that were coming, the participants, a round table. Essentially, this was a smaller group, of course, 50, then 70, and so on. And that's crucial to the philosophy of this school. It started around a small table in Lena Neverovska's kitchen. with intellectuals of the Gorbachev period meeting regularly to discuss, debate amongst themselves the travails, problems of modern Russia and its future. And then after the attempted coup, and Mr. Yeltsin on the tank, and Lena's flat nearby, and all of that she saw and witnessed there, stimulated her into, with the help of the British ambassador and the Council of Europe, to create something for the purpose of trying to change the mindset, to widen the horizons, to extend the experience of the young up-and-coming generations who were interested in their politics here in this great country and who were going to take a direct role in their local government, the regional government, the State Duma, charitable volunteer work. That was the whole purpose, to sit around, discuss and debate something which in the Soviet period really had not been possible for your generation, your age group. And here we are, still sitting around at this table with that freedom to discuss and debate. And this institution is not one which has its own set agenda. It's not, and never has been, seeking to impose an agenda or a set of views. It is concerned with values. It is, as Lena pointed out, and the pride of people coming to be with Mr. Speaker, representing the people of what we like to call one of the founding democracies of the world in the House of Commons. It is about values and establishing the freedom of expression, to expose the inadequacies of state bureaucracies, and indeed to simply make government more open, to make people more aware of the power of government and its competence or incompetence. And I think it's been a remarkable success. It's done enormous good. It's been a very effective instrument which has stimulated very great many people. And in conjunction with this Bushka just down the road here, has helped people to bond, to get to know each other, to widen their own connections, people from all over this country who probably would never have had the shared experience and got to know these people, and have maintained, many of them, the friendships and the networks which have flowed from that. And of course, that's why this particular seminar each year, focused on the media, has always been particularly of importance, because it is people like you, journalists and others working in the media, who are the instrument for opening up the world of politics and power. And so it's always been a delight for me to bring the British speakers and members of Parliament here, but particularly to this seminar, our journalists, and some of the finest ones have come through here over the last decade. And today, Hugo Rifkind, who has been a journalist on the Times newspaper, many would regard as our finest paper that's been going for centuries, has come back. He came here 2 years ago. I've, in a sense, indirectly first got to know him because his father was a great friend of mine, and, well, he is, I don't see him very much now, but we started in the House of Commons at the same time. And his father, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, became Britain's Foreign Secretary, and a very distinguished and effective politician and fine lawyer, a great mind. I remember the shock of virtually all of us when he started to make speeches in the House of Commons and he had no notes, and used to deliver very important, serious, big briefs without, again, reading, which is nowadays the practice of most people, to read their speeches. Hugo was brought up in Scotland and went to university in Cambridge, but all his young life was in Scotland. And in fact, he spent a large amount of time this year, all through the summer, back in Scotland, writing, listening, learning, writing about the referendum campaign for, well, the attempt by many to seek independence for Scotland. And that relates, in a sense, indirectly and directly in some ways, to his topic today. But he started his career on the Glasgow Herald, one of the great Scottish newspapers. And he has been 10 years on the Times, and it's quite remarkable what he does on the Times. I would recommend you buy particularly or acquire online Saturday's edition. Doesn't matter which Saturday, but every Saturday you'd actually feel that the Times newspaper was almost sort of run or dominated by this young man, because he writes a weekly column on the big issues of the day, illuminating and challenging both institutions and individuals and politics on almost any subject you care to name. He also on Saturday writes extraordinarily witty, amusing column, a satirical column, which he pretends it's a life in the day of somebody, either some idiot or some powerful politician, or, I mean, he just takes the mickey, pokes fun at all sorts of people and institutions and ideas. He's also the Times television critic, and I'm sure there's something else he does on the Times. But anyway, he also is something of a star on the radio, in that he takes part in comedy shows, panel comedy shows, particularly quite a famous one called the News Quiz. He also writes regular columns, features rather, in the Spectator magazine, and he has this ability to be concise but sharp and provocative, and he is quite often just simply very funny. So it's an enormous pleasure to have him back on what to me is one of the biggest issues facing not just Britain and our parliamentary electoral system, but across the rest of Europe and other parts of the world, which is the rise of anti-politics, the growing sense amongst populations in many countries of dissatisfaction with their politicians and the political system, and their desire to turn away from the great entrenched parties, the corruption and the sort of venality of much of Western political democracy today. And it's therefore, I think, very pertinent and poignant that today Hugo is going to discuss with you his analysis of the rise and importance of anti-politics.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Keith. After that wonderful introduction, I'm ashamed to say both that I am going to use notes, and I don't think I've got any jokes, but I'll see if I can think of some along the way. Like was said, I'm going to talk about the rise of anti-politics in the West, this sense of growing a reaction to and hostility towards what is perceived as a sort of established, self-serving political class. I'll be very interested, once I finish, to understand a Russian perspective on this, whether there are parallels or not parallels, whether this is something that is seen from here as well as seen at home. And it always strikes me that the most fascinating thing about this notion of a political class is it's a class that almost nobody believes themselves to be in. Everybody who works in politics, in the media, believes themselves to be the maverick, the exception, in amongst this class where everybody else is the same. So I would like to buck that trend by saying I am a member of the political class. I don't see how I can possibly escape that. As the introduction will have shown you, I write, as well as my columns, I write editorials in the Times, and my father is a known politician. If I'm not in the political class, who is? I realise this is becoming an increasingly rare admission which I realized first, I think it was a couple of years ago, reading a column in The Spectator, a magazine for which I write, and a journalist called Charles Moore, who is a great journalist, one of the best of his generation. He's maybe 20 years older than me. He was writing a column about benefits, the welfare state, the welfare system. And he wrote this fascinating sentence that began, "The ruling elites have very, very slowly caught up with public understanding." And that caught me because for him to be writing this, he was a former editor of the magazine I was reading. He once edited the Daily Telegraph. He was at Eton, the famous public school. He was at Oxford. He was a biographer of Margaret Thatcher. And yet there he was referring to the ruling elite as being somebody else, which was striking. And it made me think, there's something definitely up here. And it has become seen in much of our political discourse. I can talk about it most immediately in relation to the United Kingdom. It's very evident in Britain. We have this insurgent UKIP party, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is nominally an anti-European party, has sort of lately become an anti-immigration party, and is really a kind of anti-everything party in most respects. But most of its ire is focused on what it calls, again, the Westminster elite, this group of people it perceives as being running the country, this self-serving cabal, I suppose. As Keith mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the summer up in Scotland reporting on the independence referendum. And again, that was a fascinating period. There were very strong passions. But what was most fascinating about it was that what had begun as a relatively straightforward nationalist separatist movement sort of morphed into a referendum on, again, this notion of a Westminster elite, a distant, aloof body that was making decisions for a country it did not understand, and was different to, and had a different agenda and different purposes. And that's very much what it became. People talk a lot about the Westminster bubble, as in it's contained and sealed. It was a phrase I heard endlessly and was ceaselessly accused of having come from, and couldn't really deny it. Elsewhere in Europe, you can see something similar going on in many countries with parties that, if they're not necessarily nationalist, they're certainly looking in rather than out. You have Golden Dawn in Greece, you have the National Front doing horrendously well in France, you have Beppe Grillo's five-star movement in Italy, Podemos in Spain, the Sweden Democrats, and there's elements of the same thing in the American Tea Party movement, which sort of predated all of them in a way. You'll also find something quite similar in what's become known as the Occupy protests, where you have people who've been camping out in financial districts in a protest against the financial system. But they're not really just protesting against the financial system. Again, they're protesting against the idea of a financial system run by an elite that doesn't represent anybody else, supported by a political elite that doesn't represent anybody else. So this is a strong current of thought in the West. It's mainly seen, however, not in the new parties that people vote for, but I think in people not voting at all. In the last EU elections, which were this year, 57% of Europeans didn't vote. And in some countries that was far higher. I think it was in Slovakia, 87% of people didn't vote. Now, some would say there are good reasons not to vote in a European election. People are quite unclear of necessarily the relationship that the European Parliament has with their lives. In a recent issue of the New Statesman, a British political magazine, somebody described voting in a European election as the political equivalent of masturbation, in that it is something one does for one's own end and it has no consequence. There are similar trends definitely transferring into domestic politics, as with these parties discussed. And it's interesting to see from a British perspective how well, say at the next election, a party like UKIP goes on to do. Certainly the Scottish Nationalists will do very well. UKIP I'm less sure about. So the interesting question becomes why all this is happening. And there are various reasons. One argument often made is that it's about the active failures of established politics. We've had, the financial collapse caused by the aloofness and indifference of the systems designed to prevent that from happening. You've had mass unemployment in much of Europe, particularly among young people, and there have been corruption scandals. In Britain, we've had our own very tame corruption scandals in terms of the expenses scandal. But then there's also this, also in Britain, there's this sort of latent looming idea of a paedophilia scandal involving the powerful, which, while it may be baseless, may not be baseless, but still plays into the same idea of a different, aloof elite that is different from other people. And at the same time, there have also, of course, been media scandals, because one of the things I find most alarming is the sense that in the West particularly, and I don't know about here, perhaps you can tell me, that the media is increasingly being considered not to be in opposition to the establishment, but to be a part of the establishment, which is very frustrating if you're a part of it, because that's certainly not how you identify. Another possible cause for this sort of thing is the growth of alternative media. The simple fact that with blogs, with Twitter, with online activism, there are new voices that are able to shout as loudly as the old voices. So in a sense, it's not really that anything's changed, it's just that we're hearing much more that we never heard before, which is possible. But I think my chosen interpretation of what's happening is that it's a sort of mass rejection of consensual politics, of the idea that you have a politics that appeals to everybody. Because if you try to have a politics that appeals to everybody, there's always going to be a lot to object to. If you have a broad slate of politics which includes pro-business policies, then you will anger people who are not so pro-business. If you are trying to deal with climate change, then you will anger people who are against climate change. And I think we live in an increasingly selective age where we pick and choose our interests, and we don't like being handed a set of beliefs on a big slate. And I think this is becoming reflected in politics, where people look to any established political party and they see far more to object to than to agree with. Whatever the reason that all this is happening, anti-politics is a very different sort of politics to argue against. I noticed this in Scotland particularly, where, during the course of the independence debate, incredible claims were being made about how if Scotland became separate, poverty would be eradicated and everything would be wonderful and it would no longer rain and there would be the cows would produce more milk and everything. And if you turn around and say, look, this is madness, which it was madness, you are portrayed as merely a defender of the old system. And this happened in sort of every aspect of this debate. When business leaders came out and said this will be bad for jobs, well, that's just the corrupt business class supporting itself. Or when economists said this will be bad for the currency, well, that's just the banking class supporting itself. And it made me realize that as soon as you start believing in a fundamental difference between most people and the people who are in power, then you have an answer for everything. The same is true, I've noticed often, with the United Kingdom Independence Party, this insurgent party we have in Britain, that a journalist who critiques them is a journalist who is, in their mind, defending the status quo and thus must benefit from it, is a member of the political class serving themselves. And for a journalist, again, this is immensely frustrating, particularly for someone who believes themselves to be a progressive journalist, as I most certainly do. It's very difficult. In fact, in almost any one of these movements, the idea of what is going on here, of being a system of normal people protesting against different ruling people, is always flawed. If you look at something like UKIP, it's led by a public school educated former stockbroker, supported by many people who used to be in the ruling Conservative Party. In Scotland, the independence movement is in fact very much dominated by a sort of Glasgow media and business elite that is simply reacting against a different elite it sees controlling the rest of the country. There's something very similar, I often think, going on with the National Front in France. These are established, powerful people who are simply objecting to the fact that they're not quite as powerful as they would like to be. The same is definitely true in the American Tea Party. So I think it's wrong to see this trend of anti-politics to be a fight back of the masses against elites. It's actually different elites fighting each other a lot of the time. There's a British journalist called Nick Cohen, who I'm a great admirer of, and he once described modern anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory about power designed to discredit the idea of democracy, which is a fascinating idea. And it's the idea that if you live in a democracy and you're unhappy with democratic outcomes, then rather than accepting that the will of the majority might not be the same as the will of it's far easier to believe that the will of the majority is being subverted by somebody. And I often think that hostility to the political class, within reason, is a little bit like that. People see those in power and they want to believe they're not like them. But what people often perhaps don't realise is that nobody is like them. You know, we live in a series of quite independent bubbles, and people, I think, believe that they are much more representative of everybody than they are. It's very interesting that despite this sort of widespread sense of anti-politics, there's no real successful anti-politics party. There are these kind of sort of growing extremist anti-other things parties, but you don't quite have a real party that's a real tear up the system party. Probably Five Star in Italy is the closest to that sort of thing. And Beppe Grillo, of course, was a comedian. So you don't really hear, there aren't a great many new political arguments being made. Really more what you hear is a great sense of frustration that there aren't new political arguments being made. And when you do have a flash of the new, it can be incredibly popular. I mean, to go back to the Scottish independence referendum, it was an incredibly invigorating time where everything in politics was on the table and being discussed afresh. And turnout in the election, I think, was 85% in most of the country, which is remarkable in a Western election. And there was real passion on the streets, passion of the sort that many in Britain found quite frightening because we're not used to it. But it was, there's a real sort of keenness to be talking about something else, which is why I think when people often talk about the rise of anti-politics as being synonymous with the rise of apathy, and that's not true at all. I think the West has almost never been less apathetic. Yet it's just not translating itself into traditional politics. People are hungry, but they're just not quite sure what they're hungry for. This is partly why comedians have become very interesting. I mentioned Beppe Grillo before. Comedians occupy this very interesting position in Western society, I often think. And I say this sort of sometimes because I'm on the verge of sometimes being one. But many of them, I mean, they have a kind of prominent commentary role, but they have it outside of any established structure. They're not part of a media organization. They're not part of a magazine. They're not part of a TV channel. They're simply known voices. And in Britain, strangely, our political discourse is increasingly being steered by comedians, which sounds like an insult, but it's just simply the way it's going. We have this one figure called Russell Brand, who you may know of, who you might remember him from some Hollywood films. I think he played himself in Forgetting Sarah Marshall and Get Me to the Greek, which are okay if you want that sort of thing. And he's remarkably influential, particularly among young people. His views are stupid, definitely. He advocates non-voting. He advocates boycotting democracy. And he recently wrote a really terrible book in which he seemed to think that the answer to the world's problems are to behave as if we're all at Alcoholics Anonymous. He had a sort of 12-step program, 10-step, how many steps, program for healing the world. I mean, it was nonsense, but you can't deny his appeal, and his appeal is enormous, particularly among young people. And we have increasing numbers of very influential political comedians in Britain, people like Stuart Lee and Frankie Boyle on the left. In America, of course, some people say that the sort of political opposition is basically sort of led by Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. And these people are becoming very powerful political figures, yet separate from what we normally understand politics to be. We also have movements such as feminism, which are sort of surging in the West, and people are identifying with enormously. Strange as it may seem, one of the most prominent and important political writers in Britain today, I think, is a woman called Caitlin Moran, who is a columnist for my own newspaper, who recently wrote, a couple of years ago, wrote a wonderful, very funny book about feminism, which engaged a whole, sort of generation of young girls enormously. And this isn't the sort of thing we'd normally regard as politics, yet that's where a lot of the energy that once would have gone into politics is going, and that's what people are turning to instead of political parties. Because there is a belief, and I think a true one, that our political parties have become concerned really only with economics, and are all to varying degrees essentially technocrats. Where there are different value judgments between our political parties, they tend to be really about where money ought to be spent. There's very little ideology, certainly not disagreement over ideology, or ideology that declares itself to be that. And new politics, anti-politics, is all ideology. I mentioned before that the vast numbers of people had not voted in the European Parliament elections. Those who did vote were likely to be those alienated from what they perceived as being the shared ideology of mainstream political parties. People most likely to vote were poorer people from industrial cities who objected to immigration, and social conservatives from countryside areas who objected to sort of equalities, racial and sexual equalities. Well, they wouldn't say equalities, but equalities. And it's true that political parties are ignoring people like this. And they're not doing it by mistake. They're doing it on purpose, because these are the people these are not the people that you win elections through. Britain's Labour Party, the main opposition party, led by a man called Ed Miliband, is sort of believed to be pursuing a strategy which is called the 35% strategy, which is this idea that if you can win 35% of the vote, that's enough to dominate Parliament and make Ed Miliband the next Prime Minister, which is, of course, there are 65% of the population being actively ignored in that strategy. So obviously there will be frustrations here. And in part, at least in Britain, this is a function of our unreformed political system, where it's not proportional. It's a sort of winner-take-all type system. So there will always be people who are left out. I think the main reason that political parties have abandoned many of these issues is because they have no power over them. I mean, in terms of social change, in terms of equality between races and genders and all the rest of it, governments can either support this stuff or they can oppose this stuff, but it happens anyway, or doesn't, not really because of what a government does. That happens in both directions. Equalities march ahead even when governments oppose them, such as women beginning to drive in Saudi Arabia, for example, or in Britain, with the rise of the occasionally worrying rise of radical Islam in British cities. There's not very much a government can do about this. Governments have sort of, I think, understood that their social function is limited and retreated a little bit. And a lot of the other things they are powerless over are a function of globalization, in that the new politics that we hear about, the new parties, many of them object to immigration, but our politicians know that we have a system that can't really function without immigration. Or they object to big businesses avoiding tax, yet politicians think, well, if big businesses can't avoid tax, then those big businesses will go elsewhere and pay even less tax. So there's a real sense of powerlessness there. And I think a lot of our anti-politics mood is a function of people thinking that it's only them who are powerless about certain things, when in fact, of course, everybody is powerless about these things, including governments. I mean, there is, of course, to an extent, a political class. There always has been. We used to call it the aristocracy or the super rich, and I do believe today, although while I may be the living exception to this rule, I do believe today it is more porous and easier to penetrate from outside than it's been before. And I sometimes think that it's resented today in the West, not because it's so far away from people, but because it's become so much closer to people. In terms of the way the world has changed in recent decades through the internet, people have become vastly more powerful as individuals over many aspects of their life. They have vast resources. You can go online and you can be your own publisher, you can be your own pharmacist, you can diagnose your own illness, you can be your own lawyer or your own accountant. And I think there's a sense that we can all be our own politician too. And I don't know if that's right yet or not, but I'd be very interested to hear your views about whether or not it is. Thank you.
Hugo,
thank you very much for this outstanding business presentation of the political life in the West and in UK. And now Q&A session from the audience. Well, please, questions from the audience. Please remember to give your names. Vyacheslav Gorbatin from Kaluga, editor-in-chief of the journal Yosh Kalushsky. There it is, hedgehog from Kaluga. You mentioned that in the West you see this anti-politics movement. Does it mean that the role of political parties is declining? But how does society and civic society, is its role growing, or how do the other different elements of society come to an agreement?
Do you mean how can the party, how can people...
No, if it's the role of the political party is going down, the role of the civic society becoming more stronger.
Yeah, well, in some respects, yes. I mean, the role of the political parties is certainly declining. You know, party membership is falling away enormously. It's hard to see any massive corresponding growth in civic society. I think there are these sort of popular movements of protest and feminism, where a lot of that kind of stuff has gone. But I think we're losing a sense of any kind of mass identities among people. I don't think you could accurately say that any particular sort of civic society has filled the gap where people used to regard themselves as conservatives or members of the Labour movement. I don't think anything's filled that gap, no.
Так, спасибо большое, пожалуйста.
Thank you. Next question, please. Sulayev from Chechen Republic. Hugo, well, I didn't study anti-politics, but as I talk to people at different fora every day, I'm faced with complete misunderstanding of this word. What does it mean? And can you give me an explanation? What is the genesis of this word? What do you mean here? Is it denial of the existing forms of political struggle, or is it denial that power is something that somebody would struggle for at all?
I would say the best definition I could give you of anti-politics is a sense that that all forms or all existing political structures, be they the institutions themselves or the kind of lesser institutions that populate them, the parties, are corrupt, are venal, are self-serving. I think it's characterized particularly by a complete loss of faith in the idea that that anybody in public life believes in public service, I think.
Пожалуйста, да. Пожалуйста, ваша рука. Да, молчу.
Please, young man, you now have the floor, please. Good day, Dmitry Konovalov, Zabaikalsky region. And my question is, what is the fate of the United Europe in your view? And the United Europe, is it the Europe together with Russia or something separately from Russia? Thank you.
Do you mean in relation to anti-politics, or do you mean the related?
No, not anti-politics, just in politics. The relations. What are you thinking about Europe? Russia is included or not?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about the trends in Russian politics to know that. But
Europe can see it as Europe with Russia or without Russia.
Do you mean?
European Union. Europe as idea.
As an idea?
Yes, and include Russia or not?
I don't think so. No.
What do you mean? Answer that.
Okay. If I'm understanding your question correctly, I see Russia as being a distinct entity and culture from Europe. I mean, I see Britain often as being a distinct entity and culture from Europe. So I don't think that's terribly strange. But no, when I think of Europe, no, it doesn't necessarily have Russia in it. And it doesn't necessarily have Britain in it always either.
Так, сейчас, пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Your question now, please. Kristina Bravkova from Tyumen. The things that you enumerated, all those problems, but the very fact that people no longer vote, that all the examples of anti-politics and that mutual accusations, it seems to me the reason for this is the lack of discussions with some substance, in absence of good discussions. In Russia, for well-understood reasons, it's clear where it is. But what is happening in UK? Where are these discussions of substance about public matters? Where are they gone?
Well, I mean, they exist. There are. I mean, it's much maligned, but Britain still has an excellent media. There are numerous sort of very serious magazines where there's a high level of discussion. In fact, plenty of the debate that happens in the House of Commons is pretty solid. Just not the bits that people enjoy watching. And there's a strange sort of duality to it, in that on the one hand the public complains enormously about a lack of substance in public life, yet the political events they want to see are two people having a fight, and it's a problem. I mean, it's very, from a media perspective, it's a problem. I mean, as was said, I'm essentially a humorous writer, and the main thing I always try to do is I try and write about serious subjects, but in a way that people don't realize they've been reading a serious column until they get to the end. Because I think we do have a problem with public engagement with serious politics, which is possibly is it's an unfashionable thing to say, but possibly is a function of comfort rather than a function of disengagement. In that people believe, both for good and ill, that politics cannot have that much impact on their lives, so they don't worry about it so much. I think it's part of the truth.
Так, ваш вопрос, пожалуйста.
Тимур Гераськин, Республика Мордовия.
Timur Gerastin from Mordovia, graduate of 2014. Hugo, thank you very much for an interesting lecture. You said that in England you see radical Islamists. My question is, some 10 days ago, all federal media informed us of an interesting fact, that this year people who reside in UK, they would mostly call the male firstborns, the most popular name would be Mohammed. Well, this is something what all federal media reported. Do you think that soft Islamization of Europe and UK, is it over? And what are the political processes that it will give rise to in the very near future? Thank you.
Okay, the widely reported story about the most popular name being Mohammed is a great story. It's not, in fact, true, unfortunately. I think it's actually about the 7th most popular name. If I remember rightly, the fact was arrived at because there are many variations on the name Mohammed. There's Mohammed, Muhammad, Mohammed, all these things, and they were all put together in the way that names such as Charles and Charlie were considered separately, if you see what I mean. Actually, it was a little bit misleading. That said, yes, of course, Britain and Europe have had huge waves of Islamic immigration. I'm okay with that. I mean, there are small pockets of where there are problems, as is obviously seen by incidents of terrorism and people going to fight in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. These are small minorities of a minority, and Europe has dealt with waves of immigration before. So, my family came to Scotland 100 years ago as Jewish refugees from Lithuania on my father's side, and as with any other wave of immigrants, the first generation held onto its culture, the next generation assimilated a bit, and the next generation was like me and exactly like everybody else, and Muslim immigrants to Europe, like everybody else. The second generation wants to become doctors and lawyers. and the third generation ends up as humorous journalists. Tak.
Well, a change of guards took place, dear colleagues. And Sergei Gogin, please, have the floor. Good day. Politics as the sphere of public relations finds its reflection in the mass media and should be reflected there. If we speak about new politics or anti-politics, so as far as I understood from your presentation, it's still finding reflection in comic stand-up sort of presentations. Is there any normal medium, say, well-respected newspaper, for example, in UK that could be considered as the mouthpiece of this new policy? The Guardian, could it be seen in this way?
It's very much a matter of perspective. Certainly, I'm a big admirer of the Guardian, and the Guardian gives a good voice to a lot of the new politics that I like. However, on the right of British politics, I mentioned the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. They would regard the Guardian as being the mouthpiece of the liberal metropolitan elite that actually runs the country already. In terms of newspapers that have come directly out of new insurgent politics, actually a newspaper was launched in Scotland only 2 weeks ago. A new newspaper called The National, which declares itself to be Scotland's first pro-independence newspaper. There was another newspaper, the Sunday Herald, which was pro-independence, but that was sort of incidental, if you see what I mean. Whereas the founding mission of this newspaper is to advocate an independent Scotland, which as a journalist I'm a bit worried about. I don't really like the idea of overtly political media. Obviously, media has its politics, but I don't like the idea of media that starts from a mission and then attempts to justify it. I'd like to think that the media is more honest about the basic. Obviously there is a place for opinion in media, but I sort of prefer media that quests for the truth rather than that accepts the truth and then attempts to justify it.
Так. Юрий, прошу.
Yuri, please. Yuri Lobunov, Bryansk, best-known Russian publicist of the early 20th century, wrote extensively about two types of policy. He was saying there is one democracy, one politics. For some people, aristocracy of democracy and politics, they only fight to who of them would grab place in government, whereas there is another democracy for wide masses. And this democracy wants empowerment and new possibilities for the masses and wants to involve masses in governing the state. The politics that exists alone to serve the interests of some professional individuals, politicians, it's breaking down the will of the masses. This is what this publicist wrote. Do you think that it is close to the idea of anti-politics?
Yes, I think it's certainly a similar sentiment. Yes, it's definitely a similar sentiment. What I find, of course, fascinating about it is that, at least in Britain, this is probably less true in America, but in Britain it makes little sense, in that becoming a politician in Britain is a very poor way to enrich yourself. The salaries that politicians earn are, while certainly far larger than the average salary, are not huge, and the prospects on leaving Parliament for the vast majority of members of Parliament are not fantastic. So you could tell me that a self-serving, someone who only wishes to serve their own ends and the ends of their class, if you like, would become a lawyer or even a journalist. But I think it would be a very, very foolish strategy to become a member of Parliament in Britain, because it just wouldn't work, I think.
Так, да.
Well, Darya, please. Darya Grinyova, Moscow. To which extent the growing moods which you're referring to, of anti-politics, how are they related with the growing role of transnationals and their relations with the national states? With the governments of national states, these transnational corporations, I mean, the interaction, the way they interact, transnational corporations and national governments.
Oh, well, I mean, hugely, with multinational corporations, I think you mean. Yes, I mean, vastly, because they disempower governments. There are long-running fights that, the government in Britain at the moment is gearing up for a big fight with Google, for example, because Google and Amazon, all the more so, because they don't pay much tax. Yet the existing agreements with the European Union are such that they're allowed to base themselves anywhere in the European Union. So they go to Luxembourg, where they don't have to pay much tax, but do their business in Britain, or they go to Ireland, where they don't have to pay much tax, but do their business in Britain. You also have something I've written a lot about lately is governments in Europe are again fighting Google over access to over being able to surveillance, being able to spy on emails sent, to get access, to get warrants to read emails among terrorist suspects and criminals and all that kind of thing. And Google has no need or reason to comply with that because it is an organization based somewhere else. I don't really feel that Google should comply with that. This isn't something that I agree with, but it's an example of the increasingly limited powers of government. In fact, last time I was here, I spoke about the extent to which the internet posed an existential challenge towards government because it facilitated multinationalism in all sorts of ways for corporations and for individuals, and governments lose their powers. And I think that there are elements of that definitely in a sense of just wild frustration that our politics doesn't seem capable of supporting our lives.
Продолжаем. Прошу.
We continue. Ksenia, please, you now have the floor. Ksenia Botanova from Moscow. My question is somewhat philosophical, or maybe it's just fantasized. The internet has pretty much changed our life, but at that it pays very weak impact on politicians. I mean, in my country and in your country, there are quite a lot of adult men and women who need huge buildings in the middle of the city so that they should sit there and discuss important things. Then they read a number of important papers and they carrying them in cars, creating traffic jams. It's a whole story, and it all costs a lot to people to pay for this, to keep this huge number of people who are dealing in politics. Again, what's your think on this? How internet can reflect maybe on the impact politicians, maybe they will gather using Skype conferences, for example, not to pay taxpayers' money to keep the politicians, or discussing the building of the new stadium using 3D models instead in huge heaps of paper. Thank you.
I mean, I think most politicians are terrible at coping with the internet or technology generally. My father, when he was a politician, he's still a politician, but when he was in government, he left government in 1997, and up until that point, he was incredibly scathing and rude about even the concept of a mobile phone. He kept saying nobody's so important that they need a mobile phone. And then as soon as he didn't have a department full of hundreds of people to come and find him whenever he was needed, he got a mobile phone. So I think it was a learning curve in that respect. And they say that there's an old story about I think it was John Prescott, our Deputy Prime Minister. They said he had a computer on his desk, an old-fashioned computer with a monitor, and on the screen his secretary would stick bits of paper for him to read because he didn't know how it worked. So I think there's a lot of this sort of thing. And indeed, when our politicians in Britain do engage with technology, it's often disastrously. It's often saying something stupid on Twitter that causes them to resign 2 days later. Which happens, so regularly that you wonder why on earth they do it. That said, in terms of the future, I was one of the debates I went to during the Scottish referendum. There was a lot of talk about this kind of thing, And somebody said, why isn't there a government app? As in, when the Parliament is voting on something, some budget thing, something like that. Why do you need a Parliament? Why don't you just have an app and you have a referendum on everything and you just press go? And I thought, oh, that's just ridiculous. And then it stuck with me, and I do think it's ridiculous, but I can't justify that on any sort of ideological basis, that it should be ridiculous, because the functions of representative democracy have been formulated on the basis that it's simply not practical to have everybody making a decision for themselves. And that's just not true anymore. And so, as we continue with representative democracy, I think we need to have a whole new argument about why we have that, why that makes sense, why fundamentally we don't put every last bit of power into the hands of every last person. And I don't really have an answer. I don't have an answer for that. But I mean, these are the challenges that technology brings, and the manner in which that sort of thing will change our whole politics.
Коллега из Воронежа мне.
Colleague from Voronezh. Please, Georgi Matsuga from Voronezh. Tell me, please, Mr. Rifkind, is it anti-policy? Could it be a kind of modern form of populism? In real politics, we see mostly technocrats, populists, and people with crazy ideas were just displaced from politics, but the electorate remained. As a result, we got this anti-politics.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yes, it is. It's very much populism. But well, it's largely populism. The problem is because this sort of mood is populist, because it lends itself to nationalism, to anti-immigration, to a lot of reactionary politics. It's possible to sort of discount it altogether. But as I said, I mean, there are manners in which, political parties are failing their electorates. There really are, and I think the danger if we discount anti-politics as being entirely populist is that we forget about them, I think.
Алевтина, я уже начал волноваться, что...
Alevtina, I was getting worried that you're not taking part in this discussion. Please, you have the floor. I'm just modest today. I have Al Dangorol from Tiva. The question is just a colleague to colleague. What do you think it's simpler for you to present your thoughts as a journalist, satirist, or when you write serious matters? Where do you feel more comfortable and why?
It's much easier to be serious. Because I find writing satirically is writing seriously and then having to do jokes as well. It's much easier being. I never really understood this. I began as a comic writer, very much a sort of lifestyle comic writer, and my last editor, a man called James Harding, who's now in charge of the BBC, decided he liked my writing and brought me on to write editorials, where I wrote entirely seriously about foreign policy and economics and everything, which I'd never had the confidence to do before. And I was startled to realize it was much easier than what I'd been doing until then.
Евгений, пожалуйста.
Evgeny Konoplев, Moscow. And you were saying that a few minutes ago you mentioned that there's some not very smart politicians that say something in the Twitter and then 2 days later they had to retire. And so just, I'm not talking about not very smart people, because our colleagues raised this issue, and our colleagues want to see hear your opinion, because there's that they think in Russia that in European press there are very rigid standards in social networks for journalists, and very rigid standards. So there's the Deputy Minister of Economic Development in Russia who apologized for the actions of government in the social networks. He was fired for this next day. And another journalist of a radio station who spoke on Twitter, and then after a long public discussion, a professional discussion, was removed from the air for several months, and so he was relieved of the right to be present on air. And so how it's happened is how rigid you are, just so where there's division between professional and personal manifestation of your so personal and professional feelings. So then, so there was an established group of people on behalf of the minister spoke. So actually participated in the media on behalf of the minister. He had no idea that the minister had no idea that someone on his behalf would be participating and talking in the media on social media on internet.
Yeah, well, I mean the latter, yes, that happens a lot. I mean, and you always get whenever a politician does make a disastrous gaffe on Twitter, the first story is always, oh no, it wasn't me, it was my assistant, and I didn't even know it was happening. No, I mean for journalists, in as much as I can tell, there are no controls based by our employers over what we can and should say. I think there's a difference with the BBC and the rest of the media, or at least there's a difference between TV, broadcast media and print media, but in effect that means the BBC and everybody else, in that the BBC has a legal commitment to impartiality. So I could see a BBC journalist could destroy their career through a comment on Twitter, because it would create an impression that they're not capable of doing their job with impartiality, and I think that's probably reasonable because that's what the job is. For the rest of the media, I mean, it's a bun fight. It's chaos. You know, I almost sort of live on a daily basis waiting to get into trouble for something I've said on Twitter, and but you learn kind of new. You learn new standards of behaviour. Like there was one time where there's an MP in Britain called Tom Watson, and he complained on Twitter to Rupert Murdoch, the owner of my newspaper and most newspapers, that I had insulted him on Twitter. You know, he involved him in the conversation. As it happened, I hadn't. It was somebody else, and he'd got the name wrong. He'd got his bearded Jewish journalists confused. But that kind of thing, you suddenly think, I mean, you police yourself because everything you do is public, you know, and you need the trust of your readership. I'm not aware of any journalist for a newspaper or commercial media losing a job because they've blurted on social media. There may be some, but I can't think of it.
Украина, прошу.
Vera Andriuke, Ukraine. You will have heard that our policy at the preceding parliamentary elections, there were many political parties, and so I named two. The first party was the Radical Party of Lashko, whose leader was running around with a pitchfork, and so it was a PR campaign. And the second Internet party, Darth Vader was the head of it, and so he was always wearing the mask of the Darth Vader. And so one of the radical parties came to the parliament, and so became the power. And so is radical policy successful policy? Is it positive or negative? So are there any examples so similar political parties so that would give something good for the state, that would be instrumental and positive for the workings of the state? So we were afraid that Dark Vader would lose the elections. So there are lots of Dark Vaders. So there's guys from that movie. I don't remember exactly his name.
Yeah, we have them in Britain with the Guy Fawkes mask. There's the sort of big, I forget what it was. V for Vendetta? We had it in English. Yeah, lots of people wear these masks. No, I mean the closest thing I can think of to that in the politics I'm familiar with is the Pirate Party, you know, which came out of internet deregulation, came out of Scandinavia. You know, it began as an anti-copyright party and is now a kind of sort of quite eccentric kind of sort of, you know, I don't know. I think it always makes me think of the cast of The Matrix, basically having a political party. But no, I'm not sure. We haven't quite got those kinds of political movements happening. No, I don't think so.
Так.
Then okay. Why no questions from the Caucasus? So you have no problems there. You have no challenges. Yeah. Okay. Sautiyeva, Ingushetia. My question, you started out saying that someone wrote about something that the power for a long time did not understand the public feelings. Do you think that now the power, the authorities, do they understand the public's feelings? Can they follow the public's feelings? Do they feel the public feelings? This is there now a new kind of tension in the British society after the events that occurred in Syria when ISIS with its harsh methods so decapitated several journalists in the United States and Great Britain. Maybe the religious groups, etc. How the situation changed, the public landscape changed after that?
In my experience, the public landscape didn't change very much after that. And I'm not sure, I think many people expected a sort of a wave of kind of anti-Muslim sentiment after all that kind of stuff. And it didn't happen. And I can't figure out if that's because there already was one, or actually people are just a bit more sort of thoughtful than that. And people, look at this part of the world and don't think that's an extension of Islam. But relatively speaking, Britain is quite an integrated country. Everybody knows some Muslims. Everybody works with some Muslims, and so there's not really a great sense of this. Actually, this is me speaking completely as a member of one of these London bubbles. That's not true at all, but it's true in London. And so there's not this great sense of other. So there's I wasn't aware of a huge sense of hostility. I mean, and the idea of whether the government knows what people are thinking. I mean, I tend to think the government is people. Nobody holds office for that long, and particularly because they're in London, they're likely to be more reliant on the kind of services that most people use. They're more likely to use public transport. They're more likely to send their children to the same schools as the wider population, at least for a bit. So I don't really see that great sense of aloofness. No.
Вопрос имеет наш эксперт Квентин Пил. Прошу вас, Квентин.
Thank you, Andrei. I've got two questions that I'd like to put to Hugo. During the European election campaign, all my children voted Green. I think that focus of young votes has actually been underestimated by the media. To what extent do you think the Greens are part of the anti-politics you're talking about? And the second question is that we've seen in Britain in recent years more and more people demanding referendums on issues, on Europe, on Scottish independence, but also a general feeling that referendums are a good form of politics. Is this a panic by the politicians at trying to engage the anti-politics movement?
Well, I mean, very roughly, my answers are yes and yes. To the first one, as to whether the Greens are sort of a facet of anti-politics, I suppose the best answer is not nearly as much as they should be. I think one of the sort of strongest and one of the most important unrecognised political movements in Britain in the last 10 years or so is this group I think they're called People and Planet, which were massive in universities and were basically the real bedrock of kind of student environmentalism. And they were enormous, and huge amounts of the kind of activism that students and young people now engage in. You could see it in the student protests of the other year, and you see it a lot in just sort of young people's politics generally have come out of environmentalism. So it's been massively important. Yet the Green Party doesn't seem to reflect that at all. The Green Party still seems to be run by kind of sort of aging hippies in Brighton in sandals. Were I a member of the Green Party, I'd be furious all the time, although I suppose it doesn't attract people who are furious all the time, so that's not happening. The second part of your question about About referendums. Yes, I mean, people have always been demanding referendums all the time. Well, the 1990s was characterized...
For the last 20 years.
Yeah, sure, for the last 20 years. But what's happened in the last 5 years is governments have started saying yes. I mean, in Britain, we'll have had, three referendums in the space of one parliament, I believe. We had one on the voting system, we had the Scotland one. No, I suppose we haven't had the Europe one, have we? But it's gearing up. And I think it's a massive loss of confidence by government in really being able to carry people with what they want to do. Yeah.
Прошу, коллеги.
And so we have some more Makhachkala, please. Good, Shavala Yelena Makhachkala. I have a philosophical question concerning religion. So we all know that religion impacts politics, and we know that, and the politics impacts religion and the religious people. So there's this influence. And what is the interrelationship? What is the connection between anti-religion and anti-politics?
It's a difficult one for me to answer because, at least in my understanding, in Britain we don't really have religion. And we haven't had religion for hundreds of years, ever since they started the Church of England, which is a sort of anti-religion religion. And so it's very hard to see the impact of religion on our politics in Britain. And it may be simply that there is a religious background that we don't recognise as being one. Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I mean, when we have had actively religious leaders such as Tony Blair, everyone thought he was crazy. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's that much relationship. I mean, interestingly, the Archbishop of Canterbury lately, well, this one and the last one, in fact, have at times almost aligned themselves with the notion of anti-politics, with the kind of they've sort of seen themselves as being almost the sort of figureheads of the dispossessed, which is, I suppose, is what they're for in a way. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's very interesting. It's a dynamic that I don't really recognise from Britain. No.
Just explain why you think the Church of England is an anti, because I think people here would find it difficult to.
Well, it's tough. The Church of England, for the most part, it's a very how do I say this? It's a very liberal organisation. It often prides itself on doing things like producing bishops who proudly say they don't believe in God and things like that, which I suppose, I mean, I've never really thought about it. It must be immensely confusing for everybody else. It's at least within Britain, it's locked in. There's this schism waiting to happen between the British Church, which is very socially liberal, and the African wings of the Church of England, which are quite the opposite. And so it's just basically it's a sort of hub of slightly wishy-washy tolerance, I would say, is the Church of England. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah. I think it all goes back to Henry VIII, though.
Oh, sure. Yeah, okay. The history, of course, is that Henry VIII started the Church of England, so he didn't have to be a Catholic anymore, so he could have another wife, roughly, in a sentence. Wolf Hall.
Прошу, сударыня. Я слышу.
Nizhny Novgorod, I've been teaching journalism, and in 2 weeks just I graduate another group in Nizhny Novgorod. Always my parting words to my students, always how it will be. What will be my parting words to the students who have gone through this journalism course that I've given them? Because they're all adults, so they're smart people. So they know how to write. They have practice, but they don't know how to give them moral parting words. How to act a good, how to be good journalists. What will be my parting words to the future journalists who are graduating now?
Gosh. I don't know. I think I think one of the most important, the increasingly important things for a journalist now is to realize that you are always under scrutiny. I spoke before about the extent to which journalists are increasingly seen as part of the establishment rather than reacting to it. I think that's because social media has given everybody a voice, but journalists still have a more prominent voice. And I think it's quite easy. There's a danger for journalists to not recognize their own position of privilege in having one of the loudest voices in a conversation. So I think that the best advice one can give to a sort of a young journalist starting out is basically remember how many people are looking over your shoulder and how many people will notice if you mess up.
Так, записали, да?
Have you written it down? Yeah, for the parting words. And I asked one question, but I'd like to ask another one if no one else wishes to ask a question. No. We have lots of people who want to ask, but Chechnya is always on the foreground, so they want to. So then yesterday there was heated discussion about national relations in Russia, where I came up with my position about the relations between the nations. It's a not very popular position in Russia, when where I said that inter-ethnical tensions, there is xenophobia in the media, but there is no tensions between the nations in Russia. Unfortunately, this provokes people to be nationalistic. And that's the problem. How does your country address this issue? Because you have many confessions in Great Britain, many nations. How do you address this issue?
I mean, there isn't, at least recently, there isn't a great sense of the various nations of Britain disliking the other nations of Britain, except for everybody not liking the English. But that's fine. The tradition in Britain is that Scots don't like the English, the Welsh don't like the English, the Irish don't like the English, and the English don't notice. It seems to be pretty much how it works. But there's I mean, to be serious, I think one of the sort of most negative effects of the Scottish independence referendum is I think there's beginning to be a slight hostility towards Scotland from England, which is much more significant because, of course, England is 10 times the size of Scotland. Scotland is a very small country with only 5 million people, maybe 6 million, but not many. And we haven't yet had a situation of, say, a British English newspaper stirring up sort of anti-Scottish sentiment. But I could very much see it happening in the near future, if the dynamics of the next election are different. I could easily see a tabloid complaining about the influence of Scots and that. You get a bit. I mean, Scots are probably disproportionately reflected in politics and media, and you don't really hear much about that. But I could see it beginning to happen. And I mean, generally, I tend not to. As I said, I don't really worry when the little countries are nasty to the big country. But when the big country starts being nasty to the little countries, I think that's a problem.
Рецепт для России.
Is there a recipe for Russia how to avoid the media inciting and egging on the population against the nations?
Find your smallest country and put them in charge of everything.
Так. Да, всплеск энтузиазма. Пожалуйста, сюда.
Okay, there's this surge of enthusiasm. Okay, Bashkortostan. You know, Hugh, we listened to other speakers before you. and very seriously I was thinking, so how to build a democratic society, how to form new institutions in order just to make a culture so that just not to take out, so not to slap our kids and not to abuse our children, so that everyone will happen. And then when we talked about this anti-politics, I was shocked a little bit. And when you spoke about it, was this association. So you're kind of Chip and Dale, helping someone coming to the rescue, or you're like a Zora who helps people, or sometimes you put the mask of a globalist, anti-globalist, politicians, anti-politicians, and there is a mess. There is this painted veil. So it's so complicated. So we don't know. Are we going just to create some kind of foundation, unity, to consolidate with other countries? So if you are so anti-politics, you're now. So then now we need to do something in Russia, because we are at a loss, because we cannot. It's a moving target. Because who are you? And so what kind of? So maybe we need to unite somehow and just build this logic. So there's going just to be two big events, two summits of SSC and BRICS. So maybe just we need to organize another summit of anti-politicians, anti-politics. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Ну, в общем, позанимайтесь, спишитесь потом.
Yes, you need to keep up correspondence and figure out when to organize it. Okay, that maybe will be the last question. Yeremenko, Irkutsk. Hugo, could you tell me, so is there in Great Britain or Europe any forces who would be interested in anti-politics, who would be vested interest? I'm talking, for example, low turnout at the elections. For example, low turnout of the elections in Russia plays into the hands of the party in power. So is there anything like that? And so who are interested in low turnout at the elections in Europe?
Что такое партия власти? Только подскажите.
So tell us what is the party in power, because can you inscribe it into the British fabric so that he could understand what is the party in power? So that it would be easier to understand what party in power is.
I don't think so. I mean, part of the problem in Britain is that no one's quite sure who. I mean, I'm sure there would be parties that wanted to, or bodies that wanted to advocate low turnout, but no one's ever quite sure who that would benefit. So no one. It'd be hard to know. It'd be hard to know who would benefit from low turnout, because our politics is such a mess. I mean, because we're in the process of. It used to be the case. I mean, because when you have low turnout, the people who most don't vote are the most disadvantaged generally, and it used to be the case that in Britain the most disadvantaged all voted Labour. So you would have had the Conservatives being in favour of low turnout. Except it's recently becoming, the most disadvantaged perhaps might vote UKIP, and so Labour might want them not to vote. I mean, I remember during the Scottish referendum, I had a long and sort of interminably boring conversation with a professional pollster, someone who did opinion polls, and he was explaining to me that if the turnout was 70%, it benefited the yes people, but if it was 75%, it benefited the no people, and if it was 79%, it benefited the yes people again, because if you get to 82%, you bring the people from the council estates out and they vote, but if you get up to 90%, you bring everybody out and they'll be voting. And I mean, you can go mad with this stuff. I think it's the safe position for everybody to be in favour of high turnout. Then at least there's legitimacy for whatever happens.
Коллеги, на самом деле мы должны быть очень благодарны эксперту, потому что...
I think that we need to be thankful to our expert, because behind this wonderful spirited presentation, so there are serious in-depth problems and challenges. Democracy is going through difficult times now, not the best of times, and I think it is going to get worse, I'm afraid, concerning the fate of democracy. But what Razan Vallon, Pierre Razan Vallon, French thinker, calls counter-democracy is related directly to what we were discussing today, and we can find a lot of bifurcations in different subject matters related to this topic. And and so we are at the junction of politics and journalism, so we found this wonderful subject matter, and we owe for this discussion we owe it to our speaker. Thank you very much. Спасибо.
Приятного аппетита, коллеги.